You live free here. Dad, half of your pension will cover your rent, my son blurted out. And his wife, Marissa, nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world. I took a slow sip of my coffee, swallowing a mixture of disbelief and bitterness, feeling the weight of betrayal settle over the Sunday morning calm. I'm Terry Hammond, 72 years old, retired, and proud of the life I'd built. Not a millionaire, not flashy, just someone who'd worked hard, paid his dues, and now wanted to enjoy the quiet pleasures of life. Yet here I was, sitting at my own dining room table, feeling like an intruder in my own home. The sunlight streamed softly through the windows of my kitchen at 2847 Maple Street, cutting across the clutter of plates and coffee cups from lunch. The air smelled faintly of roasted chicken and fresh bread, reminders of a meal I had prepared with care, expecting family warmth, not a financial ambush. Dad, it's only fair, Marissa said, sliding a neatly printed spreadsheet across the table. The paper gleamed under the sunlight. Columns perfectly aligned, numbers itemized with chilling precision. Room rental, utilities allocation, shared space usage, food costs. Shed 200. Douglas, my son, avoided my eyes. He pushed his plate around like it might suddenly erase the awkward tension hanging between us. We've got bills, Dad. Mortgage, utilities, groceries. His voice faltered slightly, betraying the certainty he had tried to project. I stared at the spreadsheet, my coffee cooling in my hand. 1,200, half my pension that I had earned over 40 years of work, careful savings and discipline. I had never expected to be treated like a tenant in my own house. And yet they spoke as if it were reasonable, normal, inevitable. I set my mug down deliberately, careful not to show anger. I'd learned long ago that patience and silence can weigh heavier than any argument. My heart thudded quietly as I surveyed them. Marissa smiling politely, radiating control. Douglas avoiding my gaze, his confidence already crumbling at the edges. Let me get this straight, I said slowly, my voice calm, deliberate, but sharp enough to cut through the morning light. You expect me, your father, to pay rent in my own house? Marissa leaned forward, tilting her head, eyes steady. You live here. You benefit from everything. That's how it works everywhere. I picked up the spreadsheet, flipping it over in my hands as if it were a foreign object. Every line, every number, every carefully calculated cost felt like a brick dropped on my chest. But I didn't speak. Not yet. I didn't need to. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the doorway. Douglas finally muttered, Dad, please. It's not personal. It's fairness. Fairness! The word echoed in my mind like an empty echo in a cavern. Fairness. Is it fair to abandon responsibility for decades, to sit in my home, eat my food, and demand half of what I've earned? Half my pension, I said finally, voice low, deliberate. 1,200 effective April. You expect me to hand it over? And yet you act as if it's normal. But let me tell you something you've clearly forgotten. I paused, letting the words hang, letting the tension grow. I leaned back, folding my hands on the table, my calm exterior masking the storm of thoughts inside. I had a plan, a quiet one. They didn't know it yet. They would never see it coming. Because sometimes the person they think is powerless, the one they've underestimated, is the one who's been preparing in silence. And when the moment comes, justice has a way of arriving in ways no one expects. The sunlight glinted off the polished surface of the table. Marissa shifted uncomfortably. Douglas swallowed hard. Neither of them knew what was coming next. I pushed my chair back slowly, letting the legs scrape against the wooden floor, the sound sharp and deliberate. Marissa's eyes flicked up, a hint of alarm breaking through her practiced calm. Douglas froze mid-chew, his fork suspended over his plate, as if the world itself had paused. Excuse me, I said evenly, my voice soft but carrying an unmistakable weight. I need a moment to think. I'll be in the living room. I rose from the table, folding the spreadsheet neatly, placing it aside without a word. Every step I took echoed in the quiet dining room, a sound that seemed louder than it had any right to be. They watched me go, unable to anticipate what was coming next, unaware that the most ordinary man they had ever known was about to become something entirely unexpected. The living room smelled faintly of cedar polish and old books. I sank into my armchair, the soft cushions swallowing me, but my mind was anything but relaxed. I stared at the morning sunlight filtering through the lace curtains, thinking about every sacrifice I had made, every moment of hard work, every penny saved. I had lived honestly, worked diligently, and never once taken what wasn't mine. Yet here they were, sitting at my table, casually demanding half of my pension as if it were owed to them. I poured myself another cup of coffee, black, no sugar. The steam curled lazily toward the ceiling as I allowed myself to reflect, to plan. Marissa's spreadsheet. Douglas's feigned indifference. It was all part of a mistake they had made. Underestimating me. They assumed age, routine, and patience were weaknesses. But patience is power when wielded quietly, and age is wisdom in disguise. I thought back to the house itself. Every wall, every beam, every corner carried decades of memories, of my hard work, my love, my dedication. They had treated it like a commodity, a backdrop for their entitlement. But I knew every nook and cranny better than anyone. This house, my sanctuary, my legacy, was mine to protect. Marissa's voice floated from the dining room, clipped and controlled. Terry, we're just asking for fairness. It's simple. Half your pension. Nothing more. I smiled faintly to myself. Simple, she said. For them, perhaps. For me, it was a chance. A test of strategy, patience, and foresight. And I intended to win. Returning to the table would require timing, precision, and calm. One wrong word, one misstep, and the storm I intended could dissipate harmlessly into the air, leaving me just another frustrated old man. But I had spent a lifetime observing, learning, waiting for the moment when the truth and strategy aligned perfectly. That moment had arrived. I could hear Douglas muttering to Marissa, their words muffled but tense. I don't know. Maybe he'll just agree. Agreement was the last thing they would get. They thought they had power. They didn't. I had been underestimated, dismissed, ignored. Perfect conditions for a quiet but decisive strike. I set my coffee down and rose, each step deliberate, each movement measured. The room seemed to shrink as I approached the table again. Marissa's hand twitched toward the spreadsheet, as if to protect it. Douglas's fork rattled against the plate, betraying his nerves. I stopped at the head of the table, taking in their expressions. Entitlement, arrogance, fear, just beneath the surface. They had forgotten one thing. I had patience. I had preparation. And now the first move of their reckoning was about to begin. Douglas, I said, voice calm, authoritative, every syllable precise. Marissa, let's review this together. I reached for the spreadsheet, slowly spreading it across the table, as if it were a map I intended to navigate, not them. Their eyes widened. They had expected compliance, hesitation, maybe even anger. What they didn't anticipate was the calculated calm in my movements, the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do. Now, I continued, leaning slightly forward, I want to go line by line. Every number, every calculation, every expense you claim. Douglas swallowed hard. Marissa's face paled slightly. The first crack had appeared in their perfect facade. They were no longer in control. I was. I leaned over the table, my fingers lightly tracing the edge of the spreadsheet, letting my eyes roam deliberately across every column, every figure. Douglas shifted uncomfortably, as if my scrutiny alone might burn through the paper. Marissa's hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white, her perfectly composed exterior beginning to crack. Let's start with this line, I said calmly, pointing at the room rental section. 600. That's the claim for one room, right? Douglas glanced at me, trying to muster a casual tone. Yeah, just the guest room. You know, the space you're using. I smiled faintly, a slow, quiet smile that carried weight. Guest room? This is my bedroom, I said softly, letting the words linger in the air like smoke. Marissa's eyes flicked down at the spreadsheet, and I noticed the subtle twitch at the corner of her mouth, the first sign of panic. I moved on, pointing at utilities. $200 for electricity? $150 for water? My voice was steady, measured, but every syllable was a hammer strike against their carefully constructed narrative. Funny, I just checked the bills this month. Total combined, including my own consumption, it's $85. Douglas sputtered, trying to protest. Well, that's... Is it? I interrupted, cutting him off gently, letting the silence do the rest. They had expected agreement, hesitation, or even a mild argument. They hadn't expected methodical dismantling of every claim, a quiet exposure of their manipulation. I reached for my coffee, taking a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in my chest as I allowed the weight of my presence to fill the room. Their eyes darted between me and the spreadsheet, realizing, slowly, that this wasn't going the way they had planned. And food costs, I continued, flipping the paper to the next page. $250 for groceries. Funny, I keep receipts. Let's see. I opened a drawer beside me, pulling out a small folder labeled in my precise handwriting. Groceries and household expenses. All itemized. All accounted for. Everything purchased and paid by me over the past 3 months. Marissa's face was pale now. Douglas's fork lay abandoned on his plate. I laid out receipts one by one, matching prices, dates, and items. The spreadsheet's neat columns crumbled under the weight of truth. Every number they had claimed as expenses they were trying to extract from my hard-earned pension was accounted for, and entirely my responsibility already. You see, I said softly, letting the words sink in. These numbers don't match reality. You've calculated as if my money is just there for the taking, but it's not. It's mine. Every cent of my pension, earned over decades, is mine to decide, and you will not dictate how it's used in my own house. Douglas's face twitched. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. But Dad, we need help. Need help? I repeated, tilting my head slightly. You live rent-free. You have food. You have comfort. And now you're trying to convert that into a legal obligation for me to give you half my pension? Marissa's hands flew to the table, gripping the edge, as if she might push it across the floor. Her voice wavered. It's only fair, Terry. We didn't know how else to ask. I let my gaze sweep the room, calm but unyielding. Fairness is not what you dictate, I said. Fairness is integrity, responsibility, and respect. Things you've conveniently ignored. And now you're learning, the hard way, that those things matter more than spreadsheets and empty demands. I paused, letting my words hang like a hammer over them. Douglas's shoulders slumped. Marissa's carefully maintained composure began to crumble entirely. They had thought control was theirs, but slowly, methodically, the balance was tipping. And let me be clear, I continued, raising my voice slightly but maintaining calm precision. I could have responded with anger, or resentment, or confrontation. But I won't. I'm giving you clarity, transparency, and the first lesson in accountability. You wanted half my pension. You've just learned that you were wrong. Spectacularly wrongs about the nature of respect, family, and fairness. Douglas opened his mouth again, hesitation in every syllable. Dad, Enough, I said softly but firmly. I've had enough of we need this and it's only fair. The reality is this. Respect is earned, compliance is voluntary, and entitlement ends where integrity begins. Marissa's eyes widened. She leaned back, her carefully rehearsed arguments evaporating. Douglas's hands fumbled with the spreadsheet, tearing slightly at the edges. I remained calm, seated in my chair, holding my coffee, a picture of composed authority. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. My words, deliberate and precise, had shifted the atmosphere completely. The power they had assumed over me, over my home, my pension, my life, had begun to slip through their fingers like sand. I set my mug down slowly, letting it thud softly on the table. The first step is complete, I said, my voice almost a whisper but heavy with meaning. You now understand the reality of your demands. But this is only the beginning. The second step, the one that truly determines how this house, this family, and this pension are respected, is about to unfold, and you will not see it coming. Their eyes darted at me wide and fearful, but too late. The quiet storm I had been preparing for decades was gaining momentum. I had revealed the cracks, and now the structure was ready to collapse. I stood slowly from the table, letting the chair scrape softly against the wooden floor. Douglas and Marissa didn't move. Their eyes were fixed on me, wide, uncertain. For the first time, I realized the power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the passive father they assumed would comply. I was a man who had spent decades observing, planning and preparing for moments exactly like this. I walked to the living room, deliberately slow, giving them time to absorb the impact of what I had just said. The sunlight through the windows caught the silver streaks in my hair, highlighting every line in my face, every line a testament to experience, patience, and quiet strength. My movements were calm, measured, but deliberate. Every step signaled control, authority, and inevitability. Douglas finally spoke, voice trembling slightly. Dad, maybe we overreacted. I didn't answer. I simply poured myself another cup of coffee, the faint hiss of the kettle punctuating the tension in the room. Marissa's hands twitched, hovering above the spreadsheet. She was looking for a lifeline, a way to regain control, but the threads of their assumed authority had already unraveled. I carried the coffee back to my chair and sat down slowly, folding my hands over the mug. Overreacted? I said, letting my voice drip with calm incredulity. You want half of my pension. You've prepared a spreadsheet, rehearsed your arguments, and yet you think that's not an overreaction? Douglas shifted uncomfortably. We just thought it would be fair. You know, sharing expenses, contributing. Contributing, I repeated, slow and deliberate. You live here free in my house. You eat my food. You have comfort and security because of me. And now you talk about contribution? I let the words linger, allowing the weight of decades of patience, sacrifice, and quiet endurance to press down on them. Marissa's eyes narrowed. We're family, Family? I interrupted, leaning slightly forward. Family is respect. Family is gratitude. Family is understanding boundaries. And family is recognizing when you've overstepped. You are failing at all of these. Douglas tried again, his words weak and faltering. Dad, we didn't mean to. I raised my hand, stopping him without raising my voice. Calmness, I had learned, is far more dangerous than shouting. Let me explain something you clearly don't understand, I said. I have lived my life with principles. I have saved carefully, worked hard, and prepared for my retirement with discipline. You think you can take half of that because you've assumed I would comply. You are mistaken. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small folder, neatly labeled in my precise handwriting, house rules and financial records. I placed it on the table deliberately, letting it slide toward Douglas and Marissa. Every dollar of this house, every utility, every expense has been documented. Every cent you've assumed you're owed has already been accounted for, and now you're asking for more. That's not fairness. That's audacity. Marissa's hand shook as she reached for the folder, but I kept my eyes on her, calm and unwavering. Do not touch that, I said quietly. This is not negotiable, it is fact. And facts, unlike your spreadsheet, cannot be ignored or manipulated. Douglas's shoulders slumped. The arrogance that had carried him into this confrontation was gone. For the first time, I saw uncertainty, fear, and realization reflected in his eyes. He had underestimated me. He had assumed my age and patience were weakness. But I had been preparing for this day, silently, meticulously, for decades. I sipped my coffee, letting the moment linger. Silence stretched across the room, heavy and electric. Marissa's carefully cultivated composure was cracking. Her perfectly planned spreadsheet, her rehearsed arguments, her sense of control, all of it was unraveling. You see, I said finally, voice low but firm. This house, my pension, my rules, they are mine. You have assumed authority where none exists, and now you will learn what happens when assumptions meet reality. I stood again, this time moving toward the kitchen. My movements were calm, ordinary, yet deliberate. I opened a drawer, pulling out a stack of envelopes, meticulously organized, labeled and ready. Each envelope contained letters, financial statements, and legal documentation proving that every claim Marissa and Douglas had made was not only false but unsustainable. They stared at me, unable to comprehend the calm precision of my actions. The air was thick with anticipation, a tension that had been building silently for years, now finally surfacing. I've prepared for this, I said quietly, returning to the table, placing the envelopes in front of them. Every document you could possibly challenge, every argument you could make, it's all here. And every one of your claims is exposed for what it truly is. Entitlement without merit. Douglas's face flushed, a mix of anger and shame. Marissa's eyes welled with tears, her lips trembling. They had expected resistance, confrontation, maybe anger. What they did not expect was calm authority, meticulous preparation, and undeniable proof of their mistakes. I took a seat again, folding my hands over my coffee mug. Now, I said, voice measured, deliberate, we move to the next stage. You will see very shortly that the balance of power has shifted. You are no longer in control. I am, and the consequences of underestimating me will become clear. For the first time, I saw genuine fear. The arrogance they had carried like armor was gone, replaced by the chilling realization that I had been underestimated for decades. I stood slowly, letting the weight of my presence fill the room. Douglas and Marissa watched me, frozen, unsure if they should speak, move, or even breathe. Every second of hesitation they displayed only confirmed what I already knew, and their assumption of control had been a grave mistake. I walked over to the sideboard, reaching for a small stack of letters tied neatly with ribbon. Each envelope was addressed to me personally, every one a record, a statement, a proof of decades of meticulous planning and careful bookkeeping. I placed them on the table with deliberate precision, the soft thud of paper on wood echoing like a drumbeat in the tense silence. "This," I said, tapping the top envelope, "contains every record of this house, every utility bill, every expense you've claimed. It also contains evidence of my pension, savings, and financial planning over the last 40 years. Every dollar accounted for. Every assumption you made is now verifiable." Douglas leaned forward slightly, a nervous twitch betraying his attempt at confidence. "Dad, maybe we could work something out." I didn't flinch. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, sealed document. It was official, legal, undeniable. "This," I said, placing it carefully before them, "is a notarized amendment to my retirement plan and house ownership. It clearly states that the house belongs entirely to me, and any attempts to claim part of my pension or property without my consent are null and void." Marissa gasped quietly, her hands flying to her mouth. Douglas's eyes widened. They had expected arguments, maybe negotiation, but not this. Not evidence so absolute, so meticulously prepared. The house, the pension, and their false sense of entitlement were being stripped away, one document at a time. I leaned back slightly, sipping my coffee slowly, letting the silence settle. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, yet it was the exact reaction I wanted. They had underestimated me, dismissed me as an aging father who would quietly comply. That assumption had been their first and most critical mistake. "Do you see now?" I said, voice calm, unwavering. "All your calculations, all your spreadsheets, all your demands, they're irrelevant. You assumed entitlement. You assumed I would let you take what is mine. You assumed control where you had none. And now, you understand the reality." Douglas opened his mouth, but no words came out. Marissa's lips quivered. The confidence they had carried in, the arrogance that had filled their voices only hours ago, was gone, replaced by fear, uncertainty, and a dawning realization. I reached for the next envelope, pulling out detailed statements, showing exactly how much each of them had benefited from my generosity over the years and the unpaid contributions. Unpaid bills, shared living costs they had assumed were mine to cover. Every line item, every total, carefully calculated and presented. "You have lived here comfortably for years," I said, letting my gaze sweep over both of them. "And now you expect half my pension? Look at the numbers. Look at the reality. Every cent I have spent, every dime I have earned, has been accounted for. And now, you see, fairness isn't measured by spreadsheets or demands. Fairness is measured by integrity, respect, and truth." Douglas's hands trembled as he reached for the papers, but I stopped him with a simple gesture. "Do not touch them. This is not up for negotiation." Marissa's eyes welled with tears, but she dared not speak. She realized, at last, that control had slipped through her fingers. The house, the pension, the respect, all of it belonged to me, and every attempt to claim otherwise would crumble under the weight of evidence, preparation, and patience. I stood fully, letting the room feel the shift. My posture, calm yet commanding, conveyed authority beyond any words. "And now," I said slowly, "we move to the next stage. You have seen the evidence. You have heard the truth. What happens next will determine whether you respect it or continue to challenge reality." Douglas swallowed hard. "Dad, please." "We didn't." I shook my head. "You have your chance. Your arrogance, your entitlement, your assumptions, they have brought you here. Now you must decide if you will act with respect or face the consequences." The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock above the doorway. I had laid the first pieces of the puzzle, and the ripple effect was beginning. Every move, every document, every word had been calculated to expose them, to dismantle their false sense of authority. I returned to my chair, coffee in hand, letting them stew in the quiet power shift. The calm before the storm was over. The first move had been made. I leaned back in my chair, coffee in hand, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. Douglas and Marissa sat rigid, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. They had begun to realize that their assumed control over me, my pension, my house, and my life was an illusion. But they had no idea the storm I had been preparing for decades was only just beginning. I set my coffee down deliberately, the sound echoing across the room like a gunshot. "You've seen the evidence," I said softly, letting each word land with precision. "You've seen the truth. But evidence alone does not always teach lessons. Sometimes lessons must be experienced firsthand." Douglas swallowed hard, his confidence evaporating with every passing second. Marissa's hands trembled as she tried to steady herself on the table, her spreadsheet lying discarded beside her, now utterly irrelevant. I rose slowly, moving toward my desk in the corner of the room. From a small drawer, I pulled out a thick envelope stamped with official seals, legal marks, and signatures, the kind of document that could not be ignored, challenged, or dismissed. "This," I said, holding it up so they could see, "is a formal notice. It outlines the terms of living in this house and the legal boundaries regarding my pension. It is clear, binding, and final. Any attempt to claim funds or control beyond what is explicitly allowed will result in immediate legal action." Douglas's jaw tightened. "Dad, that's excessive." "Excessive?" I asked, my voice calm but steel sharp. "No, it's necessary. You see, you treated assumptions as fact. You treated entitlement as your right. Now you will understand consequences. Actions have weight, and disregard for boundaries carries results." I walked slowly back to the table, placing the envelope between them, letting it dominate the space as a symbol of authority and preparation. "This is only the beginning," I said. "The first step was exposing the false claims. The second step is establishing boundaries. But the final step, the one that ensures respect is not optional," was about to unfold. Marissa gasped, covering her mouth. Douglas leaned back, eyes wide, the color draining from his face. They had underestimated me. They had assumed age and patience were weakness. But patience, I had learned, is power when combined with planning, observation, and timing. I reached for another envelope, smaller, more personal, but equally precise. Inside were receipts, bank statements, and notes documenting every shared expense over the last 10 years, utilities, groceries, repairs, contributions I had made for the household. Every dollar they assumed I owed them, or that they were owed, had already been accounted for and meticulously documented. "You wanted half my pension," I said, voice calm, deliberate. "Now, you see how much you've already benefited from my generosity over the years, and yet you demand more. Do you understand yet?" Douglas's hands shook. "Dad, we didn't realize." I leaned forward, letting my calm authority press down like a weight they could not escape. "You will realize, and you will understand. The assumptions that have guided your arrogance will be replaced with clarity, consequence, and respect." Then I did something they had not expected. I reached for my phone, pulling up a series of pre-scheduled appointments I had arranged weeks earlier. Each appointment was with professionals, legal advisors, estate planners, and financial consultants. Every single meeting was set to formalize and protect my boundaries, ensuring that no further demands, manipulations, or false claims could touch me or my property. Douglas's face went pale. Marissa's lips trembled. Their carefully constructed confidence had been shattered completely. They had thought they were negotiating, manipulating, and controlling. In reality, they were witnessing the culmination of a lifetime of preparation by someone they had underestimated. I returned to my chair, folding my hands calmly over my coffee mug. "The storm has begun," I said softly, letting the words hang. "And every action you take from this point forward will be guided by the reality of respect, law, and truth. The house, the pension, and the authority you assumed were yours are mine. And now you will see the consequences of ignoring that fact." The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock. The weight of my presence, combined with the documents, appointments, and evidence, pressed down on them. They were trapped in a cage of their own arrogance, unable to speak, move, or resist without acknowledging the undeniable truth. They had been outplayed. I sipped my coffee again, savoring the quiet. The tension was electric. The quiet storm I had been preparing for decades had gained momentum. The first move, exposing the spreadsheet and their assumptions, had worked. The second, formalizing boundaries and demonstrating evidence, had cemented control. Now the final act, the ultimate demonstration of authority and justice, was just around the corner. Marissa's lips quivered. Douglas's hands were clenched tightly, knuckles white. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable, and yet they still did not fully grasp the final revelation I had reserved for the perfect moment. I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your chest with calm determination, and let it out slowly. The room felt heavier than ever. Douglas and Marissa sat frozen, eyes wide. Their carefully rehearsed arguments evaporated into thin air. Every spreadsheet, every demand, every assumption they had brought to the table had already crumbled under the weight of preparation, evidence, and decades of quiet observation. But the final act, the one that would cement their understanding, was about to begin. I rose from my chair deliberately, letting the sound of my movement echo softly across the room. The sunlight glinted off the edges of the polished table, catching the dust motes in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended, like the world itself was holding its breath. "Douglas, Marissa," I said calmly, voice carrying a quiet authority that made them flinch. "You've seen the evidence. You've seen the facts. You've seen that your assumptions about control, entitlement, and fairness were wrong. But seeing isn't enough. Understanding requires action." I walked to the sideboard and retrieved a small envelope, unassuming, plain, yet heavy with significance. I placed it carefully in front of them. "Inside this envelope," I said, letting my fingers linger on the edge, "is the finalized plan for the house, the pension, and all associated legal protections. It outlines boundaries, responsibilities, and consequences. It is clear, unchallengeable, and legally binding. From this moment forward, any attempt to claim what is mine will be met with immediate enforcement." Marissa's hands trembled as she reached toward it, but I gave her a simple shake of my head. "Do not touch. Read only when instructed. The content is factual, precise, and final." Douglas tried to speak, stammering, "Dad!" We didn't realize." I leaned forward, my voice soft but firm. You assumed compliance. You assumed weakness. You assumed control where none existed. Now you are witnessing the reality. Patience, preparation, and truth combined are far more powerful than arrogance and entitlement." I moved to my laptop on the side table, opening it slowly, deliberately, and connected it to the TV in the living room. On the screen appeared a carefully curated timeline, documents, receipts, financial statements, and records spanning decades, all organized chronologically. Every expense, every contribution, every dollar of generosity I had provided was meticulously documented. "You've lived in this house comfortably for years," I said, letting the words sink in, believing that your assumptions were facts. But facts are not dictated by desire. Facts exist independently of arrogance. Every dollar, every meal, every shared expense you assumed I owed you has already been accounted for. And now you see it all." I gestured to the screen. "Let's go through it together." Hours passed as I methodically walked them through every document, every receipt, every statement. Each line, each calculation, each figure proved the same thing. They had taken for granted generosity, misinterpreted my patience as weakness, and failed to recognize the boundaries I had silently maintained for decades. Marissa's lips quivered. Douglas's hands were clenched tightly, knuckles white. Their faces betrayed shock, disbelief, and a dawning understanding that they had been completely outmaneuvered. Then I pulled the final card, something they would never expect. I had prepared a series of direct transfers, set to activate in the event of disputes over my pension. Legal advisors, estate planners, and financial professionals had pre-signed documents ensuring that my pension would remain untouched, inaccessible to them unless boundaries were respected. "From this moment forward," I said, voice low but commanding, "any attempt to take control, any demand for funds, any claim beyond what is explicitly allowed, will be automatically blocked. The house, my pension, my rules, they are protected, unassailable and fully documented. The power you assumed you had is gone, and the consequences of attempting to override them are now inevitable." Douglas leaned back, defeated. Marissa's hands shook. The spreadsheets, the plans, the discussions, everything they had relied on had been neutralized with calm precision. I poured myself a final cup of coffee, taking a slow sip, savoring the moment. "You've learned a harsh lesson today," I said. "Assumptions can be dangerous. Arrogance can blind you, and underestimating someone who has lived with patience, observation, and preparation for decades can be catastrophic." Then I smiled quietly, almost imperceptibly. "And now the final part of your lesson." I reached for a folder labeled Family Agreements and Future Provisions. Inside were signed letters from both of them acknowledging the boundaries of the house, the pension, and their responsibilities as family members. They had no choice. Every legal safeguard, every piece of evidence, every preventive measure I had set in place over the years left them with one option: compliance. Douglas's face paled. "Dad, we can't." "You can," I said calmly. "You have no choice. Not because I say so, but because reality dictates it. Every move you made was based on assumption. Every action you took was based on entitlement. And now every one of those assumptions has been dismantled, one by one. Compliance isn't a favor. It's the natural consequence of truth." Marissa's eyes filled with tears. We didn't mean to. Intentions do not excuse actions, I said softly, but with undeniable authority. You will learn over time that respect and boundaries are not optional. They are absolute, and they are enforced. The room was silent, except for the ticking clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Douglas and Marissa had no words. They had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and outlasted. Their sense of control had vanished, replaced by the undeniable reality. I, Terry Hammond, was in complete command. I took my chair, returned to my coffee, and leaned back, letting the moment linger. The storm was over, but the lessons remained. Every spreadsheet, every claim, every demand had been confronted, challenged, and nullified. The house, the pension, the respect, all mine. And as I sipped my coffee, watching them absorb the reality, I realized the quiet satisfaction that comes not from confrontation or anger, but from preparation, patience, and absolute clarity. I had not only protected what was mine, but had done so in a way that was calm, precise, and irreversible. Douglas finally spoke, voice small, defeated. Dad, we understand. Marissa nodded, unable to meet my eyes. We will respect your rules. I smiled faintly. Good, that is all I ever asked. For decades I had waited. For decades I had observed. And now, in one decisive moment, every assumption, every arrogance, every attempt to control or manipulate had been dismantled with precision. The quiet storm I had been preparing for decades had struck, and its impact was absolute. I took a final sip of my coffee, the sunlight catching the silver in my hair, and let the calm settle over the room. The house was quiet, the balance of power restored, respect, boundaries, and truth reestablished. And in that moment, I knew patience, preparation, an unwavering principle are stronger than any spreadsheet, any demand, any arrogance, and they will always win in the end.